right, we are going to start the war in the Pacific here on day 7. Just a reminder, you're getting a very abbreviated version of this. Hopefully the World War II from space video helped give you a little more in-depth look, and certainly feel free to do a little more research as well. I'm trying really hard to keep these video segments to 20 minutes or less. Most of them have been coming in right around 20 minutes. So I'm going to talk you through the war in the Pacific pretty quickly, and you will have your final open-ended question in here as well. All right. Overall commander of the Allied forces in the Pacific is General Douglas MacArthur. I had talked about him just a little bit in the previous video. He also will earn the rank of a five-star general. And the commander of the naval forces, which does include the Marine Corps, is Admiral Chester A. Nimitz. The map that you see here is the furthest extent of Japanese expansion throughout the course, or throughout the Pacific theater of war. All right, the Doolittle Raid and the Battle of Coral Sea. On April 18, 1942, Colonel James Doolittle leads a daring raid from the deck of the USS Hornet on Japan. They took heavy bombers off from the deck of an aircraft carrier, which they didn't think could be done. In order to be able to actually make it to Japan, the bombers had to be stripped down of most of their weapons and could only carry a handful of bombs. As a result, it did very little physical damage to the Japanese, but it did a tremendous amount of psychological damage. The Japanese had obviously a very stunning victory at Pearl Harbor. They felt like things were all going in the right direction. They were having tremendous victories all across the Pacific, and here they were bombed by the United States. The raid itself, like I said, did very little physical damage to Japan. The planes had to fly over Japan and try to make their way into China. Not very many of them actually made it to where they were going to go. A handful of them were captured. Some of them were able to evade the Japanese and eventually make their way back to the United States. So it's basically just a huge morale boost. The Battle of the Coral Sea takes place in May of 1942. It is the first time in history that the entire naval battle that took place was done by carrier-based airplanes. The ships never saw each other. It was just planes attacking ships from each side. Neither side could claim a victory, but it did stop the Japanese from invading Port Moresby. So it turned that fleet around. The Americans had to turn around as well. It does show us the importance of aircraft carriers in this war. The Battle of Midway, largely considered to be the turning point of the war in the Pacific, in favor of the United States. In June 1942, the Battle of Midway took place. U.S. codebreakers had broken the Japanese code, JN-25. They were able to determine when and where the Japanese would attack, and as a result, they essentially hid the U.S. aircraft carriers on the opposite side of Midway, and as the Japanese planes attacked Midway Island, which there was an airfield on, the American planes then went and attacked the Japanese carriers, and it kind of falls apart in a way, and they don't find the Japanese carriers right away, and then we get a really good stroke of luck in the fact that the Japanese were actually preparing to launch their next raid, and they spotted some of the carrier planes, and so they decided to switch the armaments on their planes. So on top of their decks, they had all of their planes fully fueled up, and they were switching bombs from high explosive bombs to armor-piercing bombs to be used against the American aircraft carriers. And at that time, a flight of high-level American bombers arrived over the top of the Japanese fleet, and they dropped bombs. And when they were dropping the bombs, if they just hit part of an aircraft carrier, all of the bombs and fuel in those planes exploded, And so in very rapid succession, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk, and Japan basically no longer had the ability to expand in the Pacific. They lost those aircraft carriers, which takes them a long time to replace, and they lost all of the pilots, and they lost all of the planes. So it was a really big, important battle for the United States. All right, so now it starts the island hopping campaign. That is the Allied strategy to retake some Japanese-held islands and leapfrog over others. Japan was entirely on the defensive now, which was their plan. They were going to turn every single island into a fortress. Therefore, we decided that we would only attack the islands that had airfields or naval ports on them, and we would skip the other ones. We just needed the ones so that we could get planes closer and closer to Japan, and we wanted to make sure the Japanese couldn't launch any naval raids from islands they held. This strategy allowed the Americans to concentrate their resources and shorten the duration of the war. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan. August 1942, the Americans landed on the island of Guadalcanal. It was the first American offensive action taken against a Japanese-held island. It is also one of the longest island battles that we will fight, as it, lasts probably 3 to 4 months before they would consider the island secured. And then it's several more months before the last of the Japanese are actually defeated. In November 1943, we had the Battle of Tarawa. It was the first American offensive in the critical Central Pacific region. Guadalcanal is actually close to Australia, which is why that was significant. And so now they're moving closer towards Japan. It had a unique tidal situation known as a neap tide. And unfortunately, it caused the landing craft to have to stop about 500 yards short of the beach. And the Marines had to wade through 500 yards of water while being shot at by the Japanese. There was actually a movie made about it by war correspondents that were actually there filming the footage, and it was called Bloody Tarawa. So it was not a good situation. We learned a lot about making sure we understand tidal conditions and beach conditions before we launch an amphibious invasion. On June 15th, 1944, just over a week after D-Day in France, Americans land on Saipan. In the final days of the Saipan battle, the Japanese launched a suicidal banzai charge, the largest of the war, with over 3,000 troops. Japanese soldiers didn't believe in surrender. It went against the Bushido code, and so they would rather die than surrender. And oftentimes, when they were basically running out of hope, they would simply come out and charge at the Americans with swords or bayonets and run right at them, kill as many Americans as they could before they would get killed. Again, the Pacific War is unbelievably brutal. Very few Japanese soldiers ever surrendered, and after the Bataan Death March, most American soldiers wouldn't surrender to the Japanese either. Here we can see some pictures. We have American troops before an amphibious landing there on the upper left. You can see the landing craft, and these are the doors that drop down and they pile out. This is troops waiting ashore at Butiari in November of 1943. This is kind of similar to Tarawa, and the aspect that they had to travel 500 yards through the water under fire. These guys are not being shot at the time. This is the beaches of Tarawa. You can see the death and destruction there. And then this is just Marines coming ashore on one of the other small islands. Code talkers. The only code to never be broken in World War II was a code that was created by Navajo Indians. And they were used as code talkers in the Pacific theater of the war. They used a code that they had made based off of their language. And so it was still a code but even translated, it was translated into Navajo, and Navajo language has never been written down. And so the Japanese were never actually able to break that code, even though they did capture one of the code talkers. Now, one of the things I used to do was we would try to create a code that couldn't be broken. But obviously we're not going to do that now. I just thought it was still important to talk about the code talkers. All right, the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, that essentially finished the Japanese as a naval power. Leyte Gulf is right here in the Philippines, and we tried to draw the Japanese fleet out into the open, which worked very successfully, and we essentially destroyed their last remaining aircraft carriers. Kamikazes. The Japanese, we already showed, have been suicidal in their attacks, and they will attempt to use kamikaze attacks on the American fleet. In most cases, the kamikazes were airplanes. The word kamikaze itself means divine wind, and it comes from old Japanese folklore where there was a Chinese fleet off their shores, hundreds of years ago, that looked set to invade Japan and potentially destroy Japan when a typhoon came up, and the winds from the typhoon destroyed the Chinese fleet, and the Japanese were saved, and therefore that wind was called the kamikaze wind, or the divine wind. And now they thought these suicidal attacks would eventually destroy the American fleet and save Japan once again. All right, the two biggest remaining battles will be Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And so as we're moving closer to Japan, we see Iwo Jima here and Okinawa here. Both of these islands had airfields on them, and both were close enough to attack Japan with regular fighter planes and bombers. The Battle of Iwo Jima, when it takes place, it becomes the most densely populated place on the earth at the peak of the invasion. That's because there was roughly 75,000 Marines and 22,000 Japanese, and the Japanese had dug into the island. Now, the island itself is only 6 miles long at its longest point and 4 miles wide at its widest point. But the Japanese, they estimated, had dug over 200 miles of tunnels. And so the Japanese had largely gone underground. As a result, it made it for a very, very difficult battle. Very few Japanese soldiers were ever seen alive, as they were hidden in caves and tunnels and fired from very small openings, and would often pop up behind the Marines or alongside the Marines, not always in front of them. And this is, of course, where the flag raising took place, which becomes infamous in the fact that it becomes the image for the Marine Corps memorial. And of the guys that raised the flag, only 3 of them actually survived, and it is technically the second flag raising. The first one that went up atop Mount Suribachi, which was the highest point on the island, one of the ground commanders said the flag was too small, you couldn't see it. And so they went back up on top of the mountain and raised a second flag. Now, the only reason I bring that up is because one of the guys who raised the first flag was actually from Minnesota, and his name, oddly enough, was Charles Lindbergh. Not the Charles Lindbergh that flew the Spirit of St. Louis to France, but a different Charles Lindbergh. So we would have had 2 very famous Charles Lindberghs, but there was no picture taken of the first one. I shouldn't say that. There was not a famous picture taken of the first one. And so most people didn't know that he had ever raised a flag up there. He did not become nearly as famous as the other guys. All right, more U.S. Marines earned the Medal of Honor on Iwo Jima than in any other battle in U.S. history, ever. That still goes till today. And in 36 days of fighting, there were 25,851 U.S. casualties. And 1 out of every 3 of these were killed or wounded. Essentially, 1 out of every 3 Marines was killed or wounded. So there was about 75,000 on the island. Of the 25,851 casualties, 6,825 Americans died. Almost all 22,000 Japanese perished. Their commander was Lieutenant Colonel Kiribayashi, and he ordered the Japanese to kill 10 Americans before they died. He also ordered them to not do any banzai charges because he thought it needlessly wasted them. Some will disobey his orders and still do banzai charges. Most will try to kill 10 Americans before they die. The Battle of Okinawa will then take place in April of 1945. It becomes the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific theater. It also had the highest ratio of casualties in the entire war. There were closer to 100,000 Japanese on the island, including civilians. And this is the most kamikaze attacks of the war. So it just keeps ramping up. The closer we get to Japan, the more Japanese soldiers there are, the more kamikaze attacks there are, a higher ratio of casualties that there are. And you have to keep that in mind. All right, the beginning of the atomic age. As I talked about earlier, we knew the Germans were attempting to make an atomic bomb. And so we began making our own atomic bomb in something known as the Manhattan Project, which began in early 1942. The first test of an atomic bomb will come in Alamogordo, New Mexico on July 16, 1945. Once we knew we had made it into a weapon, we told the Japanese we were going to drop a weapon on them, or they had to unconditionally surrender or face utter destruction. And so the first atomic bomb was dropped by the Enola Gay and Colonel Paul Tibbets, who you see down on the bottom there, on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. We then again told the Japanese, you better surrender or we're going to drop another one. And the Japanese told their population that it was a natural disaster, not an American bomb that caused that damage. And so we dropped another one on Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. Then we spoke out to the Japanese again, told them the third one was going to be on Tokyo if they didn't surrender, and the Japanese unconditionally surrendered officially on September 2nd, 1945. The second one, by the way, was dropped by a plane named Boxcar. And these are the two bombs. This is a picture of Hiroshima after the bomb blast on August 6, 1945. You can see the devastation. And this is Nagasaki. All right, not a very good photograph, but you can still see the amount of devastation. All right, some of the arguments for the use of the bomb and opposed. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through these because it's actually going to be your final open-ended question. But obviously for use, Japanese refusal to surrender. Okay, and the U.S. officially estimated the conquest of Japan's empire would last an additional 18 months to 2 years. U.S. officials estimated Allied casualties at 0.5 to 1.5 million American killed or wounded in an attack on Japan, in addition to the huge Japanese loss of life. Japanese leadership was informed of the destructive power and nature of the bomb and offered a period to surrender, but they declined. Arguments opposed. The bombs were untested on a population area. They had used it in a desert, but never in a populated area. Neither city, in all reality, was a major military target. It ends up killing mostly Japanese civilians. Radiation poisoning, birth defects, and contamination would have a negative effect on the population for years. And it also set a precedent about using weapons of mass destruction in war. All right, this is your final open-ended question. You make an argument for or against dropping the atomic bomb. Just a reminder, use facts to support your opinion. This is the official surrender. It takes place aboard the USS Missouri. That's MacArthur right there. There's MacArthur again, surrendering. Excuse me, not surrendering, accepting the Japanese surrender. Results of the Second World War. So this is total, Europe and the Pacific. 400,000 dead, over 800,000 wounded. $320 billion cost. It ended the Great Depression, certainly. The United States will join many other nations and join the United Nations. We're the only major superpower without significant physical damage. So it really puts the United States to the forefront in the world. Of course, changes the course of U.S. foreign policy forever, and it is almost immediately the start of the Cold War. And that's an overhead view of the World War II Memorial that is located in Washington, D.C. And that is the end of World War II for us.